All right, we're down the home stretch. Here we go. I'm going to talk to you about Ross J.S. Hoffman's and behind, not far, always and near to him, Edmund Burke's Atlantic vision of America. As many of you know, one of the more influential fields of historical studies has been Atlantic history. And the dean of Atlantic history is a Harvard historian by the name of Bernard Bailyn. He's considered the father of Atlantic history. And Bailyn argued that by the mid-18th century, Britain's reach across the Atlantic was so extensive that its study required probing the foundations of a shared inter-hemispheric civilization. Notably, this era coincides with the life and career of Edmund Burke, and John Adams too, I suppose. Though rarely emphasized, Atlantic historians have drawn more deeply on Burke than they may recognize. In tracing their intellectual lineage, and this is a big part of this paper, tracing intellectual lineages, figures like Bernard Bailyn and David Armitage, major figures in the field of Atlantic history, have identified pre-Cold War Catholic thinkers concerned with preserving the remnants of Latin Christendom against secular and nationalist threats as early proponents of the Atlantic idea. Chief among them was Fordham University historian Ross J.S. Hoffman, who lived from 1902 to 1975. Hoffman was a conservative Catholic and a very influential Burke revivalist whose protégés included Russell Kirk, Peter Stanlis, John Lucas, among many others. Bailyn highlighted Hoffman's 1945 essay entitled Europe in the Atlantic Community as the first professional historical call for an idea of Atlantic history. There, Hoffman warned against thinking in outdated binaries, or old grooves, as he called them. As he observed, quote, "We go on thinking in isolationist concepts of Europe and America, of Eastern and Western hemispheres, of Old World and New World, or we bridge these conceptual divides, alternatively, in a universalism that takes little or no account of the realities which, after all, these concepts do designate in a rough and vague way." Instead, he urged recognition of the Atlantic community as a geographic and civilizational reality. For Hoffman, the states comprising the North and South American continents emerged from and were an extension of Western European Christendom, Burke's Commonwealth of Christian Europe. Burke's Commonwealth of Christian Europe was the specific historical and political reality Hoffman had in mind. Earlier than other Atlanticists, Hoffman, in an important 1942 book, characterized the Atlantic community as the inner sea of Christendom. The inner sea of Christendom. Throughout Hoffman's writings, the Americas are very much part of a geographic conception that Voltaire characterized in the 18th century as the Grand Republic of Europe, and Hoffman recharacterized in the 20th century as the Great Republic. That was the name of his book, The Great Republic. In this view, quote, Englishmen, Frenchmen, Spaniards, Portuguese, Dutchmen, and Danes in the early modern centuries made the Atlantic Ocean the inland sea of Western civilization. They made it an historical and geographic extension of the Mediterranean round the shores of which our civilization began. Post-war strategy, Hoffman argued, should aim to fortify the Atlantic citadel. Quote, our historical roots, our natural allies, our political civilization, and our material fortunes are staked immovably in this citadel. The Atlantic Charter, he believed, revealed the community's true nature. To Hoffman, the power of Atlantic history lay in recognizing that its nations were the progeny of Western Christendom. With the old world in crisis, the new was called to tend to its inheritance. He believed it was the destiny of the North Atlantic Triangle to reinvigorate Christendom in the 20th century, thereby securing the West's future. In a memoir of his academic career at Fordham, Hoffman alluded to this point, describing his own project in the 30s and 40s as, quote, a protracted effort to use historical knowledge to advance right principles of politics, not Catholic principles, for there are no Catholic political principles, but principles consistent with the preservation and prospering of Christian values and ultimate ends. They had been well set forth by Leo XIII in his encyclical on Christian democracy. They were essentially Burke's principles of politics. Hoffman had begun as a socialist, but after World War I converted to Catholicism and began to supplement his professional writing on contemporary European and American history with intellectual forays into the Middle Ages and ultimately 18th century British history. Burke unlocked for Hoffman a usable past that connected morality and politics, Europe and America. This convergence of Burke and Atlantic history can be traced coincidentally to the very day that Franklin Roosevelt died, April 12, 1945, when Ross Hoffman founded what was in retrospect an influential Edmund Burke Society at Fordham University. The purpose of this society was to, quote, recall the principles, values, and traditions which are the heritage of the political and international society of Christendom. Hoffman later recounted the flavor of the society's gatherings. The society hosted distinguished guests such as Hugh Gibson, Herbert Hoover's great friend and a former ambassador to Belgium, FDR's ambassador to Spain, Carlton Hayes, who we'll have something to say about in a minute, the publisher Frank Shee, Jeffrey Brun, Walter Langzam, Tibor Eckert, for our Hungarian friends, former Hungarian prime minister, and Evelyn Waugh. Footnote, or fun fact, as the kids say. Evelyn Waugh and Hoffman were buddies, and they would go hiking in Spain quite a lot. And there's a very charming little book that Waugh wrote called Scott King's Modern Europe. It's an excellent book, and about kind of an aging classicist. And Hoffman is the source, the inspiration for Scott King. Let's see, where was I? There, 3 years after, so these gatherings basically fostered transatlantic intellectual exchanges and advanced Burke studies and led to a revival of interest in Burke after 1945, which most of us are familiar with. But it began earlier than the 1950s. 3 years after the Burke Society's founding, Hoffman and fellow Fordham historian A. Paul Levac released an influential new anthology of Burke's political writings in 1948, and it's published by Alfred Knopf, its mainstream publisher, is very influential anthology. In their substantial introduction to the volume, Hoffman and Levac directly drew out the historical and contemporary connections between Burke's politics and Atlantic history. Quote, they wrote, "Our history seems to lengthen as we grow aware of the ancestral inheritance that we share with older nations across the Atlantic, and of the heavy responsibilities that attach themselves to us." Burke's vision of America's place in this tradition was also made clear by Hoffman and Levac. Quote, "In the age of the American Revolution, Burke looked upon Europe and saw there a universal similitude of religion, laws, and manners. America, too," he said, "was part of that moral and political order." Not surprisingly, Hoffman supported U.S. entry into World War II, believing America had rediscovered its mission. Mission? What? To defend the Great Republic, rooted in Western civilization and the Atlantic community. Prolific journalist and friend and public intellectual Walter Lippmann actually coined the phrase Atlantic community in 1917 when he saw with Hoffman that North America was now the central region of the Atlantic world and thus was largely responsible for its protection, which was in turn essentially the obligation of self-protection. During World War II, Lippmann praised Hoffman's insight that the Atlantic community could only survive as a concert of free nations, united by mutual consent, not force. Lippmann was a critic of isolationism, but he was not an ideological interventionist. His interventionism was restrained by his sense of the relations between America and Europe, which was historic and concrete and not based on abstract universalist notions such as democracy and equality. Indeed, Lippmann reassessed his previous faith in democracy after World War II and became a critic of American liberalism. This philosophy of moderate interventionism, not a phrase we hear much today, Lippmann shared with Hoffman. Hoffman and Lippmann were not alone in viewing the Atlantic community of states as the progeny of Western Christendom. that international community of which the Atlantic is the inland sea. Columbian historian and great friend of Hoffman's, Carlton J.H. Hayes, himself a prominent Catholic convert and Roosevelt's ambassador to Spain, as I mentioned, put Frederick Turner's reigning frontier myth of American historiography into perspective in his 1946 essay when he famously asked, quote, "The American frontier of what?" Hayes was writing to professional historians as president of their guild and challenging them to, quote, broaden their conception of the frontier and extend their researches and writings into a wider field. He attacked their polar view of American history, their exaggerated sense of American exceptionalism, in Balin's words. Specifically, he challenged historians to rethink the received understanding of the advancing frontier in North America and see it again as their earliest American forebears saw it, as a frontier of Europe. "We used to know we were Europeans as well as Americans," he lamented. Hayes argued that Americans were modern Europeans living on the frontier of Europe. He characterized this insight as a historically broad vision and opposed it to the restricted interpretation of Turner and others. Such a shallow and circumscribed view of America's relationship to Europe was a principal cause, according to Hayes, of modern isolationism. But if Jacobinism was the great threat to the unity of this civilization in Burke's time, in Hayes it was late 19th and 20th century nationalism, to what Hayes called the Jacobin nationalism of the First French Republic and Napoleonic Empire. Britain, he said, countered this with a traditional nationalism, articulated for it by Burke. For Burke, Hayes argued, quote, "The state was a permanent union whose ends could not be accomplished in any one generation. The people, the nationality, were not distinct from their government, and they had no right to break the social tie which linked them to their forebears." Hayes singled out three aspects of Burke's traditional nationalism for special emphasis and application. First, Burke stressed and glorified the aristocratic political nationalism of the British, and particularly the British Constitution, as the supreme embodiment of the genius of the English nation and its historical experience. Second, Burke stands as a pioneer in the exposition of the principle of nationality. Nationality, according to Burke, does not signify a mere geographic entity or just an aggregate of individuals who happen at a given moment to live under common government. Nationality is a concrete expression of continuity, of an extension of people in time as well as in numbers and space. And third, the traditional nationalism of Burke was not quite so exclusive or paramount as the contemporary nationalism of the Jacobins. On the contrary, Burke advanced and pressed the idea of a hierarchy of loyalties, each supreme in its own sphere and all perfectly natural because all are traditional. For example, a man should be loyal to his family, his locality or region, to the national state, to the world and humanity, to God. Fundamentally for Hayes and for Ross Hoffman in his wake, Western or European civilization was a proxy for Christendom, what Hoffman called the Great Republic. As Burke wrote in the Regicide Peace, the writers on public law have often called this aggregate of nations a commonwealth. They had reason. It is virtually one great state, having the same basis of general law, with some diversity of provincial customs and local establishments. Though Burke died believing this European commonwealth had been shattered, Hoffman argued that it was partially recovered in the 19th century, and that Burke's vision was instrumental in its renewal. But in the wake of two world wars in the 20th century, Hoffman and his intellectual heirs, John Lucas, Russell Kirk, Peter Stanlis, Francis Canavan, among others, feared that a far greater calamity had overtaken the West, and no true restoration had yet followed. Still, Hoffman believed the deepest instincts of our republic lead us to set our hand to the task. The deepest instincts of our republic lead us to set our hands to the task. A full renewal, he said, would require leaders with something of Burke's moral and political imagination. In our own time, demographic change and shifting political sensibilities have challenged Hoffman's view of an Atlantic community, an international civilizational order with the Atlantic as its inland sea, the rise of the so-called vast early America movement, championed by scholars at the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, which is an independent research and organization sponsored by William and Mary, no surprise, reflects a broader trend within American history now to de-Westernize American history and dismantle older narratives that framed America as the outgrowth and culmination of European civilization. Yet in intellectual pendulum swing, American triumphalism is resurgent in some quarters, with new nationalists and populists regularly criticizing Europe as weak, corrupt freeloaders. They see Europe not as a cultural inheritance, but as a decadent foil. Where Burke and Hoffman sought to save Europe from itself, nationalists today often seek to leave it behind. Conversely, Burkean nationalists, from Burke and Hoffman to Europe and Scruton, saw America as Europe's heir, not its rival. Their conservatism favored continuity over rupture, order over revolution, and moral imagination over ideological fervor. While they shared skepticism about modern, bureaucratized, secular Europe, especially institutions like the EU, which we could obviously go on about, they never abandoned its cultural and civilizational bonds. These are difficult and contested questions. A more grounded conservatism would resist both universalist abstraction and narrow isolationism. As Burke insisted, preservation and reform must go hand in hand. Hoffman's work reminds us that transatlantic ties are not merely strategic, but civilizational. The task remains. Can a Burkean nationalism, historically grounded, morally serious, culturally rooted, be revived? Can scholars rediscover the civilizational vision that inspired Hoffman and his peers? Can they resist ideological hostility and instead imaginatively reforge the comparative, transnational connections that sustain civilization? If so, it will depend on a renewed commitment to a traditionally conservative scholarship and forging public policy that considers our Republican political society and the wider Western Christendom with the same seriousness, the same love of reality, and the same practical moral imagination that animated Burke's lifelong effort to understand and renew the world he inherited. Thank you.